Hello, hello, hello! Regular viewers of this channel will know that I sign every video off with God Save the King, with the king being the living symbol of the British nations. But how well have the actual kings and queens of our country ruled, especially from the 20th century to now? Are they deserving of our loyalty? Have they derelicted their duties? Have the Windsors actually served the interest of their subjects, or have they instead served the interests of our managerial, bureaucratic, mercantile regime? Watch this to find out. If we are to evaluate the rule of the Windsor monarchs, we first need to understand what exactly the role of a king or queen should be. Though, of course, today we have modern kings and queens who behave in modern ways, the traditional role of kings draws from a far more ancient conception. So, what defined the relationship of ruler to ruled? Well, one idea is that the king is like a shepherd, and his people like sheep. Potential belittlement aside, whilst this does accurately portray the sense of authority held by a king, one problem here is that the shepherd is not of the sheep, and the sheep are not of the shepherd. Nor does the shepherd act ultimately for the good of the sheep. At the end of the day, sheep are livestock animals ultimately there to provide resources and food, not a great example for any king. Instead, a better analogy is that of the father. Indeed, patriarchy, the system across almost all traditional human societies, does not mean rule of men, but specifically rule of fathers. So, what exactly is the role of the father? These days, the role of a father and the role of a man in general have been totally perverted by liberal ideas, government-funded psyops, egalitarian crap like feminism, or worse still, the sort of principle that children should lead the parent-child relationship. I don't need to tell you, my dear viewers, that this is utter bollocks. As, of course, are the attitudes of men like Andrew Tate the e-pimp or Elon Musk the lecherous merchant. These are not good male role models. Instead, the role of the father is as follows. Unless he is a cuck, the father is sovereign over his family. His duty is to protect the family, in line with the evolved psychological biases of Darwinian evolution. The father has authority over the child, but uses his authority in the interest of the child. The child does not lead the father leads the child. The child, of course, has not consented to this, but instead was born into it, and unless the father completely fails in his role, the child accepts this and cherishes this. If the father reneges on this duty, he is a failure. He is honour-bound and soul-bound to protect, watch over, and provide for his family. And in the ancient days, so too did the father lead family prayer. The house gods, with their nice little shrine, were usually entwined with the family ancestors. Sometimes quite literally it was ancestor worship, right back to the earliest men who were deemed closest to the gods. So the father was not only the physical protector and provider, but he also fulfilled that role spiritually. And so this was the ancient role of the father. As the household became bigger and branched into clans, the clan leader was the father of fathers, the eldest father of the clan. And eventually this too developed finally into the conception of the king. The king, the patriarch, was sovereign in the role of father of the nation. The king was the decision maker, the interpreter, and the protector, temporally and spiritually. That is the most essential relationship of ruler to ruled. That is the ideal king. But now, how do the Windsors compare? Now, it needs no saying, but it's been a very long time since we felt a monarch who quite fulfills the role as I've just laid out. To be fair, Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth did come to have an air of being the grandmother of the nation, and many people did feel a personal connection there, but it was never quite like the traditional patriarchal role. Nor now, of course, does King Charles fulfill that role. But, of course, there is clear reason for this. This may come as a shock to clueless constitutionalist Tory boys, but at the end of the day, perhaps even for the last few centuries, the monarchs have not truly been sovereign. But what do I mean by this? Well, despite holding nominal ceremonial sovereignty, de jure sovereignty, actual sovereignty means something completely different. Sovereignty, as far as the true right is concerned, means the ultimate ability to effect real change and make real decisions. I've spoken about the alarming nature of true power in a recent video, and that does certainly play into it, but at an even simpler level, if you can't change a policy without winning the fight that may follow, you do not have decision-making power, and you are not sovereign. Like him or not, King Henry VIII, in his efforts to divorce his first wife by fabricating a brand new religion, against the entrenched power and will of the Catholic Church, proved that he was sovereign. King Edward VIII, in his failed efforts to marry Wallis Simpson as king, proved that he was not sovereign. That's the difference I'm talking about. But besides that, if we look back again at my video about true power, which ultimately determines who is sovereign, I claim there that true power has two components. The first is persuasive power, the lesser form, whilst the second is coercive power, which itself is ultimately perceived destructive capacity, the greater form. The ability to tank the economy is true power. The ability to psychologically manipulate the public to your will is true power. The ability to strike en masse and bring industry to a screeching halt is true power. Owning industry and owning large parts of the economy, provided you would be willing to bring it down or harm future prospects, is true power. So, in this light, ask yourself, do the monarchs have much true power? The answer to that is, of course, no. In fact, ever since the restoration of King Charles II, and especially since the so-called Glorious Revolution, the monarchs have had less power than the aristocracy and merchant class. Nowadays, the aristocracy too has no true power, which is something you can watch more about in my video, How Lords' Reform Broke Britain. Needless to say though, the Windsors are not truly sovereign, so it would not be entirely reasonable to expect Windsor monarchs to fulfill the ancient authentic ideal of the patriarchal king. Still, despite not being true sovereigns, the Windsors have enjoyed some level of true power, so we can still assess the question of whether or not they failed us based on how they've wielded the power they do have. This is where we get into the real history. Now, I should say that much of this video has been inspired by Apostolic Majesty's stream, Queen of the Ashes, Elizabeth II and Modern Monarchy. One theme in that video is the Latin phrase by Sir Thomas More, which translates to, "He who is silent is taken to agree." In other words, if you could have done something, but did not, that can be taken as a decision to tacitly agree in and of itself. Though this phrase perfectly encapsulates much of the performance of the Windsors, the actual starting point of this segment's focus is far worse. But how so? Well, again, I talked about this in greater detail in my video about Lords' Reform, and again in my video about true power, but still it bears mentioning a third time. Come 1909, Great Britain was embroiled in somewhat of a constitutional crisis. Oh, but Blamblas, didn't you say that constitutions do not matter? That they're merely a mask for true power? Well, yes, they are a mask for true power. So I suppose that what you could say is that rather than being in a constitutional crisis, which one might expect to be adjudicated by the then interpreter of the constitution, the king, what we really had is a power struggle playing out through the British Constitution. What happened was that in 1909, the then Liberal Party politician Winston Churchill and the future Prime Minister David Lloyd George were trying to push what was called the People's Budget. Now, the People's Budget was, in every meaningful way, a socialist budget designed to do away with the ancient property rights held by Britain's nobility since, I believe, the signing of the Magna Carta. The People's Budget was passed in the House of Commons, which was dominated by the merchant class, but was vetoed by the House of Lords, which represented the aristocracy. At this point in time, the House of Lords still had veto power on anything coming from the House of Commons, and so they did veto the budget. But this caused a bit of an uproar. The democratically elected House of Commons trying to push a nominally pro-worker budget blocked by the unelected House of Lords. Oh, the outrage. Yes, my dear followers, the decline really did go this far back. But, theatrics aside, the fact that His Majesty's government couldn't even enact a budget was quite a serious issue. In any case, His Majesty King George V became king in 1910, inheriting this messy power struggle. However, rather than upholding the ancient rights of the nobility, the king instead sided with the merchants. The Commons were trying to introduce the Parliament Act of 1911, which would strip the Lords of their veto power. The Lords did not want to budge, but the king said that he would forcefully remove them and pack the House of Lords with as many compliant nobles as it took to get the Parliament Act passed. I mean, here it is, the king quite deliberately going out of his way to undermine the power of the aristocracy in favour of the merchant class. Unfortunately, that did the trick and the Lords folded. Thus ended the power of the aristocracy and the power of the monarchy, not through revolution, but at the behest of an idiot Windsor king. And that's kind of been the story ever since. The Windsors consistently, when they have made choices of their own, or had the chance to express views of their own, have sided with the merchant elites, with multicultural globalism, with the very ideas that are destroying us. And it's not like what happened with the Parliament Act 1911 was a one-off either. Take a look at this, the then Princess Elizabeth's 21st birthday speech in South Africa. Full video linked below.
Everywhere I have travelled, my parents, my sister and I have been taken to the heart of their people and made to feel that we are just as much at home here as if we had lived among them all our lives. That is the great privilege belonging to our place in the worldwide Commonwealth. I hope I shall come to know many of them. There is none of my father's subjects whom I do not wish to greet. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Okay, it's less obvious then, but still, the workings of multiculturalism are still in there, and it's a far cry from the patriarchal ideal I gave at the start of the video. Stuff like imperial family, I want to meet all of them. I mean, really? I know quite a few places in the empire that I wouldn't even want to smell, let alone have to greet people in. But if you thought that's bad, watch this horror piece from 2004.
Every religion has something to say about tolerance and respecting others. One of the most important of these teachings is contained in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It is a timeless story of a victim of a mugging who was ignored by his own countrymen, but helped by a foreigner, and a despised foreigner at that. Everyone is our neighbour, no matter what race, creed, or colour. The need to look after a fellow human being is far more important than any cultural or religious differences. Diversity is indeed a strength and not a threat. I believe tolerance and fair play remain strong British values, and we have so much to build on for the future.
Absolutely disgusting. But look, it's not like King Charles is any better. In fact, I'd argue that he's worse. Nor does Prince William look promising, if we're being totally honest. The whole lot of them, since George V, have been utter crap. And like, okay, David Starkey might spend 45 minutes talking about how profoundly conservative Queen Elizabeth was in her private life, but what's it even matter? First of all, I think Conservatives do nothing to prevent the direction of political travel, and should be written off as soft-headed cowards. Conservatism may have aesthetic appeal, and appeals to those too fearful of radical change, but it is fundamentally not a restorative force, but instead only a brake on the wheels of a runaway train. At best, it's a parachute to slow your fall from heaven, but it can never get you back there. But in any case, it doesn't matter how conservative you are privately, if your political ideals and the few instances where you do get to do something only ever go the way that we're all against. I'm sorry, but if that's the case, then you're of no bloody use to us. In fact, worse, you are our enemy. And yes, there are many other things I could talk about to labour my points here. I could talk about the Australian constitutional crisis, wherein the Queen totally abdicated her authority by doing nothing at all. Or I could talk about the failure to back Rhodesia, or South Africa for that matter, even when in that case the government actually wanted the Queen to help, meaning she could simply have hidden behind the government policy. Or I could talk about the activism done by both King Charles and Prince William, who have been awful in their own rights. For the sake of brevity, I can't go into all of these things in detail, but I do encourage you to watch Apostolic Majesty's stream for all this extra information and analysis so that you can make up your own mind a bit better. But for now, it suffices to say that, indeed, the Windsors have often failed to act, and whenever they do act, they push things in the direction of decline, in favour of the myths presented by the capitalist merchant elite and their favoured politicians, and against the interest of the common people of these British Isles. As far as I'm aware, the Windsors have at no point taken a stance against the government, but instead have always provided the governments with legitimacy. As nice as that may sound in abstract, what it really means is that the Windsors have always been pushing policies that are harming the British nation. As far as I'm concerned, they've been a total disaster. So yes, that's how things have been with the Windsor dynasty. If they weren't hiding behind the veneer of political neutrality, something that has not been the norm at any point in history other than now, and is not in line with the traditional role of the monarch, they were instead using the power that they had to further the agendas of whatever government was in power. The monarchs, who by right have a duty to the common men of their nation, have totally failed to protect the national interest, have allowed untold horrors to unfurl under their watch, have seen the faith they swore to protect fall incredibly far from anything sincere, wholesome, or holy, or even relevant, have hidden behind the veil of pragmatic neutrality, have granted legitimacy to some of the worst governments this country has ever seen, and yet still now smugly preach to us about tolerance and multi-foreigner inclusion. Okay, let's look again at the analogy of the monarch as the patriarchal father. The aristocracy could be said to be the aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, and other elders of the nation family, whilst the merchant fills the same role for the nation as the state educator fills for the child. Let me ask you then, would you deem it as a failure of the father to limit the influence of the extended family in favour of the state educators? Would you deem it as a failure of the father to leave the education of the child totally in the hands of the state? Would you deem it a failure of the father to treat as equal the children of other families as though they were his own, despite sharing no heritage? Would you deem it a failure of the father to ultimately push the influence of the state educators right to the point where the father has no control himself? And, if so, would you deem it a failure of the father to go along with that plan and make no effort to raise the alarm or take control back? Analogically speaking, this is what the Windsors have done and more. The children, our nation, have symbolically and literally been left to an evil state run by merchants to be filled with insidious lies and denied their rightful inheritance. It is abject failure of the highest level. I want to make it clear to people that I am still a monarchist. The government type I favour is still absolute monarchy, but I want a monarchy in line with the ancient ideal standards. I cannot help but notice that the Windsors have been nothing short of an absolute disgrace and have utterly failed to fulfil the ancient role. Under their watch, and indeed partially due to their actions, Britain has gone from being the number one most powerful nation and empire to have ever existed on Earth, the peak of humanity in many regards, to a dystopian mess that would have previously been unimaginable. Not only was this not prevented, not only was it tacitly permitted, or even at times encouraged, but still now there has been no word of alarm or regret. The liberal bugmen have demanded tame compliance, and our rightful sovereigns have these days been ever meek. The Windsors have only ever provided legitimacy to our evil regimes, and have totally failed the traditional duties of the monarch. And yet, despite compliance, despite providing legitimacy to the regime, the monarchy is weaker now than ever before since the Restoration. This is the legacy of the Windsors. In my view, though they have served as a great economic boon, they have been a useful diplomatic tool, and they have served as a source of cultural unity, they have otherwise done us no good. In fact, in many cases, they have done us harm. I do not think that any of this will change under a Windsor dynasty. To answer the question of the video, did the Windsors fail us? Yes. Yes, they did. Lastly, before I sign off, you may be wondering why I still insist on ending my videos with the phrase, God save the king, despite not being a fan of the actual person of the king. To be honest, part of this is because it's something I've always done. My political change has been recent, and when I started this channel, I was still in the small c conservative Windsor loving camp. Though that's changed now, I think I'll still keep the outro around. The king is still the living symbol of the British nation, with God being the symbol of all the forces of nature, and that's the sense in which I mean things. So I think that's enough by itself. Also, I must say it is a little bit tactical too. I'm not treasonous, nor do I intend on ever becoming so, but that little affirmation serves as a bit of a reminder too. Mind you, there have been plenty of radical leaders who kept the old kings around, so make of that what you will. But yeah, I'll keep things the same for now. If enough people don't think I should say it and want me to change it, then I will. But anyway, I'm sure this video has gone on long enough. If you did find it interesting, do please write a comment. Other than that though, as always, please like, subscribe, and God save the king.